And now the tactics of the Russian terrorists, concentrated airstrikes on the energy infrastructure of each region, hopes pinned on Tomahawks. Can missiles turn the tide of the war? And the fighting in Kupiansk, the enemy has entered the city. Greetings to you all. This is the Operative Duty program from the Specor editorial team. We analyze information from open sources about the hottest spots on the front line. Our guest in the studio is Roman Pogorily, co-founder, analyst and commentator. We are facing setbacks on the battlefield. Since the offensive didn't succeed, now the enemy, they are trying to break the will of the Ukrainian people to demoralize the population before winter. They are spreading panic.
They have been trying to break our will for a very long time. And we see that literally every night something is hit somewhere in the country. Drones, missiles are flying in. And if we talk about the energy infrastructure, that's more relevant as winter approaches. They know that the cold is coming. And once again, they are trying to break us in this way as well. And I wouldn't say that this is specifically related to the front, their failures or anything like that. Right now, we are also striking their infrastructure, particularly oil refineries. They are really feeling a fuel shortage at the moment. This could be seen as a kind of response, revenge, but still it's more about the cold because the energy infrastructure was one of our weak spots that they were trying to exploit. But, well, I think by now Ukrainian society has long been prepared, long integrated into all these events, and this is definitely not a case where we can be broken by this.
Despite the stabilizing actions of the armed forces of Ukraine in Dobropilya, the enemy is building up its forces and deploying reserves from the 8th Combined Arms Army. So if we look at the map, we can see the following, with the forces of units from the 51st Russian Combined Arms Army, the enemy is advancing along the highway. Having advanced towards Novoekonomikne and entered the city itself, the enemy is trying to concentrate its forces as close as possible and strike at Mirnohrad. Right now, the enemy is moving towards Mirnohrad, essentially with the forces of 3 brigades. These are the 5th, 9th, and 39th from the 68th Army Corps, also from the 68th Army Corps itself. The enemy is advancing in the area of Chervony Lyman and in the area of Rodensky. It is clear that the enemy's plan is to reach Mirnohrad through Chervony Lyman and encircle it from the north. We also have a situation where this very Dobropilya salient, which our armed forces had to cut into pieces, is now quite active. And it's too early to talk about a complete encirclement. The enemy is putting up resistance. And by the way, they are also throwing in reserves that were concentrated in Rusiny Yar and Poltavka. In particular, they are deploying the 8th Combined Arms Army, its units. They are also deploying the Marine Infantry, which is currently being transferred to the Sofivka area. So this is the current situation. The enemy is in the area of Dorozhne. The occupiers with the forces of 2 brigades are essentially trying to hold their positions nearby. In Novye Shakhovyi and Shakhovyi, the enemy is still trying to recapture the previously seized village of Vilna, but they are not succeeding. There are constant counterattacks. At the moment, the enemy has not achieved any success. Enemy units from Kucheryavyi Yar, if you look, are trying to put pressure on the settlement of Ruske, as well as towards Sofivka, in order to essentially break out of this area. Ukrainian forces who are currently in this area are also trying to put pressure on the enemy from the west, not allowing them the opportunity to leave this sector, although there is a small area through which the enemy is still trying to counterattack and is deploying significant forces. The situation is also difficult in the area of Shakov, Sofivka, and Pankivka. Enemy units from the 51st and again the 8th Combined Arms Armies. They are trying to strike from the flank. Recently, enemy counterattacks were also observed, carried out by mechanized units supported by tanks and APCs. The enemy, with significant forces, tried to advance from the direction of the occupied Mayak and Nekonorivka toward Volodymyrivka and toward Novye Shakove, apparently trying, so to speak, to assist the enemy holding the defense in this sector, attempting to break out from it. From the south, pressure is being applied to Pankivka from the occupied Mayak. Recently, the enemy has brought in reserves, the ones we've been talking about. All of them are directed towards Sofiyivka and again toward Ruske in order to outflank our troops from the northeast. The paratroopers repelled the attack that came from the direction of Mayak. The enemy suffered significant losses. However, they are not giving up and are still trying to close off this entire triangle with their forces and resources, and for that they are moving in reserves. If you look at Pokrovsk itself, at the Pokrovsk agglomeration, you can see that the gray zone around Pokrovsk has somewhat expanded to the south. The enemy is advancing from the direction of 1st of May. They are also making gains in the Kotlin district. Unfortunately, enemy movement is being recorded along the railway. The enemy is also deploying units, including those from the 2nd Combined Arms Army. There is an advance in the southern part of the city of Pokrovsk. The enemy even managed to enter one of the districts of Lazurne and partially into the Shektarsky district. The enemy has entered the city cemetery. In fact, fighting is already taking place in the urban areas on the southern outskirts of Pokrovsk. The enemy is infiltrating in small groups. We also see that there is an advance from the direction of Shevchenko towards Chinoshain. The enemy is trying to reach this road. Pokrovska Sinuvata, in order to reach Novopavlivka and move towards Babij, as well as the roads to Pokrovsk, we observe pressure towards Hnativka and Novopavlivka. These are the two settlements where the enemy is trying to focus its attacks. The 51st Second General Army, once again with its own forces, has now intensified strikes from the area of Kotlene and Udakne. The direction of the strikes indicates that the enemy will likely move towards the Pokrovsk-Pavlograd highway in order to cut it off and, let's say, occupy the area. Here is the area of Shevchenko, Belitske and Rodinske. Obviously, the enemy's intention is to cut the highway and move in that direction. Shevchenko. We now have the opportunity to ask about the current situation in the Dobropilia direction with the Chief Sergeant of the UAV Reconnaissance Company of the 42nd Separate Mechanized Brigade, named after hero of Ukraine, Valery Hudzi, call sign Ron. He's in the capital today and was able to personally join us in the studio. Let me remind our viewers about the QR code on your screen. This is a fundraiser for drones for the 42nd Separate Mechanized Brigade. Welcome. Hello, my friend. Please tell us, considering the situation and the fact that your units are involved in the defense of both Pokrovsk and Dobropilia, from the very beginning of the enemy's appearance in this sector, who were we dealing with? Were these the sabotage and reconnaissance groups that were talked about so much? Or was it actually infantry, since equipment and a large number of personnel had already been recorded?
At first the enemy was probing us. These were sabotage groups, but then they started bringing in regular troops. Assaults with equipment began and attacks started from different directions. The enemy is active. The enemy hasn't abandoned the idea of making a pincer movement and trying to cut us off, both Pokrovsk and Kostiantinivka, driving a wedge between these two large agglomerations.
And tell me, please, despite official statements about encirclements, in reality the military doesn't record them and avoids using that term. That word, encirclements. There may be encirclement, maybe partial, but not full. The enemy still has a way out through the bottleneck. Even if narrow, it still exists. And they are trying to widen these bottlenecks in order to cut off our flanking positions. Tell me, please, as you can see, the enemy is not fleeing. There is no panic. Panicked retreat of personnel, abandoning positions or weapons. The enemy no longer surrendering.
No, the enemy is not surrendering, and this is above all very strange and even evokes a certain respect, a kind of military respect. But what happens is, well, they go in there, 12 to 15 men try to enter, but only 3 or 4 make it through. As for their moral and psychological state after these assaults, well, there are some questions about that.
Please, let me ask you another question. Who are we dealing with right now? Who exactly, still, judging by the tactics and the way the fighting is conducted, what do you see? Is this already... Are these well-trained regular troops, or are there mobilized, inexperienced soldiers present? And who is currently opposing us in the air?
Right now, it's a real mixed bag over there, presenting a complex and varied situation. There are some highly experienced and well-trained units deployed. Usually, those brave individuals who go in first are specifically trying to draw enemy fire onto themselves, acting as decoys to protect their comrades and reveal enemy positions. This is in stark contrast to the formidable forces from the Russian Federation, which possesses seemingly unlimited financial funding and a vast pool of very skilled and highly specialized experts at their disposal, enabling them to conduct extensive and sophisticated operations.
Tell me, please, drones on fiber optics, how many of them are there now in the Dobropilia direction? How much do they interfere and disrupt our logistics? And are you also disrupting their logistics?
There are a lot of them. In this direction, it seems to me, there are more of them than anywhere else. Before this, they were in Vovchansk, but there weren't that many of them there. But here, every road is under their watch. There are separate units that monitor the roads, and there are individual drones that fly and monitor the roads. There is separate infantry that goes out and destroys these drones. Logistics is very difficult.
Please tell us, the personnel who are moving forward, as you say, they are drawing the firepower of our defenders onto themselves. What is their age range? Socially, if you happen to capture any of these guys, what are they like? Who are they? What are they?
From a distance, they're convicts, or if you look at their age, they're men from more precisely 40 and up. Their social status, they're unwanted, they're not needed first and foremost.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Let me remind you, that was the Chief Sergeant of the Bepak Reconnaissance Company of the 42nd Separate Mechanized Brigade, named after hero of Ukraine Valery Hudzia, with the call sign RON. Don't forget about the fundraiser. The QR code is on the screen. We're raising funds for drones and fiber optic cables, which are very much needed right now by our guys in the 42nd Separate Mechanized Brigade. For ours and for yours. Trump stated that he might approve the transfer of Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine if Russia continues the war. However, he added that he would discuss this with Putin. These missiles, developed in the 1980s, are long-range, up to 1,600 kilometers, with a warhead weighing nearly half a ton. The cost of one is $12.5 million. Such missiles could help Ukraine strike military factories deep behind enemy lines. However, for now, Kiev will have to fight with what it has. However, according to experts, missiles will obviously not be a panacea. Russia is also modernizing and has air defense systems that can shoot them down. What should we expect? Alina found out. Forest.
Trump and Zelensky discussed the possibility of Ukraine receiving long-range Tomahawk missiles. Both American and Ukrainian publications are literally full of such headlines after the recent talks between the leaders of the two countries.
Russia is afraid that the Americans might give us Tomahawks. This is a signal that this kind of pressure might actually work to achieve peace.
And although no one is revealing exactly what was agreed upon or the specific timelines, such details remain undisclosed for now. However, the mere mention by the US president of the now legendary missiles that could end up in Ukrainian hands only intensifies the collective Tomahawk hysteria among Russians.
It wasn't Medvedev speaking while peering into a bottle. It was Putin himself who said that we will have worse relations with America. They will be almost completely crossed out this way.
Putin's worst nightmare, or the Tomahawk missile, which is a multi-purpose long-range cruise missile made in America. Known for its high accuracy, this weapon was an element of potential deterrence against Russian aggression even back in the Soviet era.
At first, it was actually designed as a carrier of nuclear weapons that could quietly sneak up. Somewhere it would quietly explode, somewhere it would quietly destroy something on a serious scale. And this was a system of counteraction between the Americans and the Russians. Well, not the Russians back then, but the Soviet Union.
The very idea that Kyiv could get missiles makes the Russian dictator break out in a sweat, experts assure. There's also the fear that, because of the precise Tomahawk strikes, Putin's war machine will start stumbling even more.
But what kind of strikes exactly? That will be determined by the military. The military are absolutely pragmatic and cynical. They simply calculate how much a strike is worth and what they will get out of it.
The low-level flight of the Tomahawk makes it an ideal weapon, for example, for strikes on drone manufacturing plants, command posts, and the occupiers' airfields. But hitting the Kremlin directly is something Trump is unlikely to allow, experts say. And they name other high-value targets. In particular, the strategic heart of Russia's gas system known as the Yarmolyuk. Nearly 20 different gas pipelines converge at this junction, and a single precise strike could deprive Russia of 85% of its gas. However, you can't bring down the Russian Federation with just 2 Tomahawks, emphasizes Oleg Katkov. Therefore, the effectiveness of this weapon depends on the number of missiles Ukraine could potentially receive.
It's a high quality but still an ordinary cruise missile. It can be shot down. And not all Tomahawks that are launched will reach their targets. So there was this question, how many of them can we actually launch right now?
Here's another topic for discussion. What will we use to launch the missiles once we get them? The Tomahawk is a ship-based naval missile, and although launches of this missile were previously demonstrated from ships, now, according to experts, it can also be launched from land-based launch platforms.
There is a contract with the Netherlands, and apparently there are such platforms in Germany for ground-based launches. I wouldn't rule out that one of these platforms is already here with us. And I distinctly remember a statement made by Merz, who clearly stated that we will not actively help Ukraine develop long-range ballistic weapons. However, we will indeed provide assistance to Ukraine with regard to long-range strikes, and you will undoubtedly see this unfolding very soon.
How successfully Ukraine will be able to launch Tomahawks also depends on American intelligence data, in particular high-precision elevation maps and up-to-date satellite images. We can obtain them exclusively from the United States.
When a Tomahawk is in flight, it uses navigation systems that, based on the terrain and its imagery, allow the missile to understand where it is located. These are the TERCOM and DSMAX systems. TERCOM is when the missile flies and scans. It scans the terrain beneath it and compares it to a reference map that is precisely tied to coordinates. DSMAC is image comparison. The missile flies and takes photographs, and it compares them to a reference image, which is also tied to coordinates.
$12.5 million for a single Tomahawk. Experts call the prices for these legendary missiles very steep. However, they reassure that in the event of a hypothetical supply to Ukraine, a secret and rapid procurement mechanism would be used. This refers to the PORU system, whose mechanism allows our partners to finance the procurement of American weaponry. Alina Lisova, Alexander Alifanov, Timofey Koshchey for Spetskor 1+ Marathon. United News.
Please tell us, can the Tomahawk change the course of the war? That is, how many missiles do we need to destroy their industry?
The course of the war only if we are given a truly enormous quantity, but that's impossible. It's the same story as with the F-16S, with others, with Leopards, with Abrams. They will strengthen us, they will be part of military operations, of course, and there will be some special uses because this weaponry is specific. Maybe we might even finally reach the Crimean Bridge. But this story, on the one hand, is more political, that the Americans will help us, that we'll be given such weapons. It really triggers the Russians. On the other hand, as I've already emphasized, this is another reinforcement, but it's not a panacea. But it's very important, just like any weapon we need, because anything that kills Russians is useful.
With small infantry groups, but in constant waves, the enemy is assaulting Kupiansk. The situation is difficult. So from the north, the enemy is trying to penetrate into Kupiansk under the units of the 6th Combined Arms Army and the 1st Tank Army. The enemy is pressing on the city itself, trying to advance toward the central part of the city. It is now known that the enemy is consolidating on the northern outskirts. In Kupiansk, specifically in one of the districts, Yuvilenie. The enemy is also trying to push toward the center along Michurina and Lenina streets, attempting to break through to the city council and the local history museum. This is according to the observer Kostiantin Marshovets. They are pressing from the north, from the direction of Holubivka. The enemy is also trying to attack from Radkivka, flanking through Kindrashivka. It is very important for the enemy to enter and capture Kupiansk because Kupiansk is a logistical hub which allows them to transfer forces here. There are troops here, quite good railway connections, so the enemy does not abandon their intentions, bringing in reserves and employing the full range of their weaponry from UAVs and aerial bombs to artillery. Overall, the situation on this section is not very favorable for us. Why? Because if things were to go badly with Kupiansk, our entire military group positioned here would undeniably be at significant risk. Specifically, this critical situation would impact this particular area, namely Petropavlivka, Piszczana, and Kolesnikivka. Now we can proceed to cover another important part of the overall strategic direction a little bit more thoroughly. In particular, we're talking about the Lyman direction. The situation here is also quite difficult. The soldiers themselves are saying this. The enemy is also deploying a lot of personnel and equipment. If you look at the map, you can see that the enemy, with units from both the 1st Tank Army and the 2nd Combined Arms Army, is trying to break through in the area of Novoselivka. Here we can see it. The enemy's directions of movement are attempts to break through to Novoselivka, Shandryholov, and Drobisheve Yarove. So these are the directions of the enemy's attacks. Their offensive is employing a significant amount of resources. The defense forces are blocking the enemy, and further advancement in the area of Serednya and Shandryholov. However, the fighting is very intense because the enemy may have figured out where our weak spot is, and they're simply trying to throw as many of their soldiers as possible into this spot. The situation is also difficult in Yampol. If you look at the map, and in Torske, the enemy is attacking from several directions at once. We can see that in Yampil, the enemy has managed to get in. However, we can't say definitively that the enemy has taken Yampil. According to the military, the enemy has concentrated its efforts in the area of the railway station. That's basically where they're holding their position, and their attempts to enter the city center have been repelled by our troops. And the enemy was pushed back to the railway station. Also regarding Dronivka, judging by the map, our defenders are managing to hold the northern part of Dronivka. Along the Chorny Jerebets River and along the opposite southern bank of the Siversky Donets in the Dronivka-Serednyanka sector. So here as well, the fighting has become much more intense. And we can see that the enemy has chosen the general direction of advancing toward Lyman, aiming to encircle Lyman from the north, as we can see, both from the direction of Drobyshev and from the direction of Lyman itself, trying to outflank Lyman from both sides. To sum up what was said above, the enemy is trying to reach Lyman and cut off most of the communications. In this direction, having reached the Siversky Donets, at 2 points where it merges with other rivers, that is, those that flow in the north are Nitrivus, Novoselivka, Drobashovo, as we can see. And those beyond the Chorny Jerebets River, that's the southeast. This is Yampil and the area around that same Dronivka, where the enemy has directed its strikes. The situation in the Kupiansk area changes almost daily, so to find out what's currently happening in this operational zone, we have the opportunity to speak with the commander of the 429th Separate Unmanned Systems Regiment, Achilles of the Special Operations Forces, Yuri Fedorenko. Greetings to you, Mr. Yuri.
Glad to welcome you. Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. Mr. Yuri, please tell us, given the current situation, what is the situation in the city according to your information? Is it true that we are actually detecting the enemy on the northern outskirts? And let's say, is there a large enemy presence on those outskirts of the city? Enemy forces?
At the moment, Kupiansk needs to be considered comprehensively, and we will start with left bank Kupiansk, Kupiansk's left side. You correctly noted during your report that it is very important to maintain the ability, in relative safety, to operate the crossings by the defense forces, from the left to the right bank, in order to provide their grouping with all the necessary forces and means for active combat operations. And at the moment, I was in left bank Kupiansk the day before yesterday. The situation with the crossings is quite difficult because the enemy has actively launched their campaign. The use of drones, both those piloted via signal transmission on a certain frequency range, as well as those operated through fiber optic connections. As a result, the enemy is trying as actively as possible to keep choke points under control, such crossings. And periodically they deliver fire strikes using their artillery, but they do this more sporadically. Why? Because we manage to quickly detect where the enemy artillery is located and respond to it quite effectively. Where are we seeing direct success? Destruction, where we manage to disable a gun by damaging it, or force it to relocate, and as they say, keep it on the move. That's why at the current moment the additional defense force is introducing this concept. Security corridors. Security corridors. I think everyone in our country knows what that means. Every citizen understands what that is. These are nets that are stretched across dangerous routes to prevent enemy FPV drones from getting through. If we talk about the city of Kupiansk itself, about its northern outskirts, it's important to understand that a number of operations were carried out by our special services to clear out the enemy who had infiltrated the Moskovka area on the northwestern outskirts. These enemy groups were found, eliminated, and those who surrendered were taken prisoner accordingly. But the enemy doesn't seem to want to surrender. The propaganda in the Russian Federation convinces them that captivity is worse than death. As a result, the enemy tries to fight back until the very end. However, a certain number of such prisoners were taken. If we talk about the northern outskirts, you know the situation with the pipe that lasted for a certain period of time. The enemy managed to restore it from an engineering standpoint and use it to house their personnel. From the first house, from the left to the right bank on the outskirts of the city of Kupiansk. After precise targeted strikes, with certain firepower means, the pipe was damaged and is currently not being used by the enemy to transfer personnel. At the same time, the enemy is forced to use a long logistical route. Here's what I mean. All the way from the Dvorokansky sector, they chose those areas of the Oskil River that are the most densely overgrown and swampy, in places with reeds and also where the greenery comes right up to the water itself. Accordingly, on the right bank, the situation is exactly the same. The enemy tries to jump into those spots that are immediately covered by greenery, or those where they can observe thanks to our reconnaissance assets. At the moment, we are able to effectively destroy enemy forces moving across the crossings, consisting of up to 10 infantrymen. According to average estimates, all of them are eliminated either on the left bank or while crossing the river in groups. However, the enemy still has a constant flow of personnel from the left to the right bank, unfortunately. This personnel enables them to carry out assault operations, particularly on the right bank bridgehead, and right now, on the northern outskirts, the defense forces are putting maximum pressure on the enemy in order to cut them off at the Oskil River. In particular, these tasks are being carried out by the 429th Regiment under Colonel Files. After this task is completed, the enemy will not be able to infiltrate the city itself with its few sabotage and reconnaissance groups. Kupianskaya. At the moment, if we talk about the city itself, the enemy has not captured any of the districts. There is still a certain concentration of sabotage and reconnaissance groups who disguise themselves in civilian clothes, who put on Ukrainian uniforms and who act as spotters, directing themselves, but at the same time, measures are being taken to detect and eliminate such groups. We need to understand that in order to completely eliminate the possibility of the presence of sabotage and reconnaissance groups, and to be sure that they are no longer there, we need to close off the main entry point. This is the northwestern outskirts of the city of Kupiansk, all the way to the very bank of the Oskil River. And right now, everyone involved in the Kupiansk sector is actively working on these tasks.
Thank you. That was Yuri Fedorenko, commander of the 429th Separate Achilles Unmanned Systems Regiment. Information about the situation in the Kupiansk region and in the city itself. Mr. Roman, considering the enemy's numerical and firepower advantage, it will become increasingly difficult to drive them out of the northern outskirts if they manage to entrench themselves,